Capitol Hill, one chamber, two names history never meant to place side by side Jasmine Crockett and Barron Trump. In front of 312 students and 11 hidden microphones, Barron challenged her integrity, calling her unqualified, unfit, and un-American. But Jasmine didn't argue. She pressed play, and a 47-second recording detonated everything. What happens when the mask slips and the son of a legacy admits it was all a lie? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights inside Georgetown's debate hall didn't just shine, they burned. News crews surrounded every corner, their lenses locked on a single entrance. Security flanked both sides of the stage, every seat packed, every mic live, and then the doors parted. Barron Trump, 18 years old, towering at nearly 2 meters, stepped into the spotlight like a prince reclaiming his inheritance. His eyes scanned the room not with nerves, but calculation. Every move, every breath rehearsed. This wasn't a college debate. This was a coronation. The press had already named it the political baptism of Trump's second son. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. No introductions, no forced smile, just silence and a stare like sharpened steel. The Texas congresswoman, a former civil rights attorney, didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her presence alone sliced through the room like tension through glass. One look at her, and it was clear she didn't come here to speak. She came to end something. Two figures, one stage, no room for mercy. And everyone watching knew by the time this night ended, one of them wouldn't walk away clean. And then just as the air thickened into something electric, the moderator broke the silence with a carefully chosen question. To both of you, how can we better engage young Americans in the political process? Her voice was calm, but even she sensed it. This wasn't going to be a typical policy discussion. Jasmine Crockett moved first. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted her mic and began. Her tone was low, almost conversational, but every sentence carried weight. She spoke of forgotten neighborhoods, of underfunded schools, of young people who never saw themselves in the system they were expected to trust. She talked about voter suppression, civic literacy, and the importance of giving Gen Z the tools to participate, not just the pressure to show up. We don't engage youth by lecturing them, she said softly. We engage them by listening first. A few heads in the crowd nodded slowly. Even some of the students, live tweeting, paused their thumbs midair. But Barron didn't nod. He didn't blink. He waited with perfect posture, his fingers clasped in front of him like a closing argument ready to strike. And then, without changing his expression, he leaned toward the microphone and cut the air like a blade. Congresswoman Crockett. He began, his voice smooth but razor sharp. You are the perfect example of everything that's wrong with American politics. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Not a single person moved. The sudden shift from dialogue to assault was so jarring, it knocked the breath out of the room. Cameras panned, eyes widened. One student near the back whispered just loudly enough to be picked up on a hot mic. Did he really just say that Barron didn't flinch? He leaned in closer, his tone colder now, each syllable aimed to wound. You're not here to educate, he continued. You're here to perform. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The venom was in the stillness, the precision. Your career is built on noise, not impact. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Jasmine sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Barron gave it one final twist. And let's be honest, he said, letting the pause linger, you are fundamentally unfit to guide this generation. You are a danger to democracy. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was paralyzing. Like the second before lightning hits. Like the moment everyone realizes they're no longer watching a debate. They're watching a war, and one side just fired the first shot. The silence after Barron's words wasn't awkward, it was suffocating. Not a breath, not a shuffle, not even the buzz of a phone. His final sentence, "You are a danger to democracy," still echoed through the speakers like a verdict handed down in a courtroom. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. Everyone braced for impact, but she didn't move. She didn't frown. She didn't reach for the mic. She didn't react. She didn't cuss. She didn't flinch. She just sat there still as stone. Her gaze locked on Barron like she had been waiting for him to say those exact words. Not in surprise, but in strategy. Her posture didn't change. Her hands didn't shake, but her eyes. Her eyes told a different story, cold, precise, like a sniper who had been waiting all night for her target to step into range. Barron didn't realize it yet, but the moment he fired, he walked straight into her scope. The students could feel it. Something was shifting. A few phones slowly rose from laps, hesitant, unsure, but drawn by instinct. Not for clout, not for drama, but because deep down everyone knew this wasn't going to be a typical rebuttal. It wasn't going to be a back and forth. Something heavier was coming. Jasmine moved, slowly, silently. She reached into her blazer, not sudden, not theatrical, but with the steadiness of someone who had done this before. She pulled out her phone, not to film, not to call, but to end the conversation. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Her eyes never left Barron's face. No one in the audience said a word. They didn't have to. Every heartbeat in the room was already screaming the same thing: she's not going to respond. She's going to expose. And then Jasmine Crockett moved, but not like someone reacting in anger. She moved like someone who had waited patiently for the moment her opponent would hang himself with his own words. With the entire auditorium frozen in anticipation, she slowly raised her eyes and looked straight at Barron Trump. There was no rage in her stare, only precision, the cold clarity of someone who had been prepared for this exact confrontation. Her fingers tapped her phone screen with surgical calm, and her voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a closing cell door. "If we're going to talk about fitness," she said, each word delivered like a hammer, "then I think everyone here needs to hear this first." No dramatic pause, no build-up, just a soft click. And then it began. The first sound was Barron's voice, clear, confident, and undeniably real. "I don't actually believe half the stuff I say." The recording played, echoing through the speakers like a confession dropped in the middle of a courtroom. "It's all just performance. Dad taught me how to win power." The room didn't gasp. It froze. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. The tone wasn't one of a mistake or a private musing. It was strategy. It was calculated. It was damning. No one could pretend it was fake. No one could argue context. This was raw. And as the recording continued to play, it carved through Barron's reputation like a blade. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't gloat or smile. She just stood still, letting his own voice become the judge, the jury, and the sentence. The auditorium had shifted from a debate to a trial, and every student knew they were witnessing the collapse of something carefully constructed. A boy who had come in draped in legacy was now stripped bare by his own words. "It's all just performance," the voice repeated, slicing through the silence like a scalpel. Barron sat motionless, but his hands curled tighter around the edges of the podium. His jaw clenched. His posture stiffened. But he didn't speak because what could he possibly say? All around the room, students exchanged glances that said more than words. One girl near the front row covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God," while another leaned toward her friend and muttered, "He actually said that on tape." But the recording didn't stop to make room for their reactions. It kept going, steady, merciless, undeniable. Barron's polished persona was unraveling in real time, and every passing second felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like truth was a tactic, like belief was an obstacle, like conviction was for amateurs. Even those who had once supported him sat still, stunned by the sound of betrayal. A student wearing a Georgetown Young Republicans jacket, who had cheered when Barron entered, now stared straight ahead, blinking slowly, as if trying to convince himself this wasn't happening. Jasmine didn't need to add anything. Her silence was louder than applause. This wasn't her victory lap. It was his collapse, and she was giving the truth space to do its job. Every line in the recording peeled back another layer of the image Barron had tried to build. Every second chipped away at the myth he had carried into that room. Then from the center of the auditorium came the voice that broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. One student, stunned, leaned forward and said what everyone else had been thinking. "He's done. He's actually done." The words hung in the air like a final nail being driven in. No one laughed, no one cheered, because it wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something deeper, something heavier. The collapse of a mask, the reckoning of a name. And Jasmine Crockett, without ever raising her voice, had lit the fuse and stepped back just in time to let the truth burn. The recording kept going, but the silence in the auditorium got heavier. The more Barron spoke, the more the room began to shift, not in volume, but in temperature. Everything felt colder, more surgical. The illusion that once cloaked him in polish and promise was being stripped away layer by layer in real time. And Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just stood there letting his voice do the unraveling. It was like watching a monument collapse, but this one had laid its own dynamite. There was no sound in the hall now except for Barron's voice echoing through the speakers. And what came next didn't just chip away at his image, it torched it. "Look," he said casually, like, "this wasn't political suicide, she's actually smart. Like her arguments make sense if you really listen to them." You could feel the audience recoil without moving. Compliments from the same mouth that had just called her a danger to democracy. It was worse than hypocrisy. It was exposure. Still, he continued, "I have to call her extreme. Our crowd eats that up." The words weren't loud, but they were loud enough. They weren't sharp, but they cut deeper than any insult he'd thrown live on stage. "They want villains. I give them villains." It wasn't just an admission, it was a strategy, a blueprint. Every insult he had hurled at Jasmine was now confirmed to be a rehearsed line in a well-managed script. She wasn't a threat to him. She was a tool, a role, a chosen scapegoat to make him look like a rising star. Gasps didn't come yet. They were still buried under disbelief. But the room was beginning to stir. Faces that once showed excitement now mirrored confusion, betrayal, something close to shame. And still the tape rolled on. "Honestly, I'll say whatever I need to say if it helps build my brand," he said, like he was talking about shoe sales, not civic duty. "It's all about image." The line hit harder than any political argument could. Not because of its style, but because of its certainty. There was no hesitation in his tone, no regret. Just the mechanical mindset of someone who'd learned how to fake it until everyone else believed it was real. People think they're supporting ideas, but really they're just clapping for characters. That was when the room began to breathe differently. A few students shifted in their chairs. Some folded their arms. Others stared down at the floor like they'd just woken up from a long, orchestrated dream. Then came the sentence that stopped even the movement. "Voters," he said with a quiet scoff. "They're not citizens. They're an audience. You give them what they want to see." There it was, the mask off. The lie not just told, but embraced. Barron wasn't just pretending. He was proud of pretending. He wasn't failing to tell the truth, he had rejected it altogether. The silence that followed wasn't shocked anymore. It was hollow. It was heavy. Students who had once looked up to him now looked at him like a stranger. The boy who had walked in looking like the future of a political dynasty was now speaking like someone who had mistaken performance for leadership optics, for substance manipulation, for strategy. Jasmine still hadn't moved. She didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't smirk. Her stillness was its own kind of storm. She stood in the eye of it, letting every word of the recording land without interruption. And then, just when it felt like the damage had plateaued, the recording leaned into its final descent. The tone in Barron's voice changed, just slightly. Not nervous, not remorseful, but something more private, more revealing. The funny thing is, he said, "I actually agree with her on a lot of things." A pause filled the room like an oncoming wave. Criminal justice, climate, some of her economic stuff too. Now it wasn't just hypocrisy, it was self-destruction. But then came the kill shot. "But I can't say that out loud," Barron confessed with a slight laugh in his voice. "The Trump brand needs enemies," a single sentence. That was all it took to bury everything that had come before it. All the speeches, all the branding, all the posturing. The myth that had floated over him like armor cracked and fell to the floor. He had turned Jasmine into the villain not because of disagreement, but because it was useful. He had silenced his own beliefs to serve a narrative, and that narrative demanded a target. In this case, a black woman, a congresswoman, a truth teller, a mirror he refused to face. The auditorium didn't explode. It imploded, quietly, brutally, as if the entire crowd had simultaneously realized they had been looking in the wrong direction all along. Some students dropped their phones to their laps, no longer filming. Some looked down ashamed to have once cheered. One or two shifted in their seats like they couldn't stand the weight of the chair anymore. The applause Barron had expected to leave with had died long before the recording even ended. And Jasmine, she just stood there silent, composed, unchanged. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. And Barron Trump had just handed it to her, one damning sentence at a time. The recording had ended, but its echo still pulsed through the room like a heartbeat no one could quiet. The auditorium didn't breathe. It processed. Faces once eager were now pale, some stunned, others slowly collapsing into the weight of what they'd just heard. Jasmine Crockett stood at her desk, still composed, unreadable. Her phone now rested face down, but its message hovered like a storm cloud over everything. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't acknowledge the gasps or the shifting bodies around her. She only looked at Barron, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with something colder, something final. And then she rose. The chair behind her slid back with a quiet scrape, subtle but commanding. Jasmine stepped away from her seat and walked toward the center of the stage, not rushed, not hesitant. Each step was measured, deliberate, like she had waited weeks for this exact path to unfold. Her eyes didn't leave him, not once. Barron stood there, hands braced against the podium, his expression locked in a strange, flickering mix of defiance and disbelief. But even at nearly 2 meters tall, he seemed to shrink with every inch she closed. She stopped just short of standing toe-to-toe, but close enough that he had nowhere else to look. And when she spoke, it wasn't a speech. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. "You called me unfit," she began, voice low but impossibly steady, the kind of voice that doesn't rise because it doesn't need to. The silence that followed made every syllable feel heavier, like lead dropping onto marble. "But you just admitted I'm intelligent, that I'm principled, that I'm more trustworthy than the very people you claim to respect." There was no pause for drama, no upward inflection to rally applause. Her tone wasn't performative, it was surgical, a slow dismantling of the very lie that had just unraveled before their eyes. Barron didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched tighter, his fingers twitching slightly along the edge of the lectern. The student section was frozen, not out of confusion, but awe. Everyone could feel it now. They weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching someone being unmasked by the very person he tried to bury. Jasmine's presence expanded without her moving. She didn't need to wave her arms or raise her voice. She didn't posture. The weight of her truth did all the lifting. She took one more step, not threatening, not aggressive, just undeniable. Her voice dropped slightly, almost conversational, but her eyes were locked like a laser. "So tell me," she said, each word slow and deliberate, "what is politics to you, Barron? Is it truth or theater?" The question didn't need volume. It didn't need echo. It needed silence, and it got it. You could have heard a pen click in the back row. The irony, of course, was brutal, because the boy who had built his entire platform on controlling narratives now had nothing left to say. And for the first time all night, his silence spoke louder than anything else. The weight of the moment stretched across the room like wire pulled tight. Students who had once leaned toward Barron were now visibly shifting away. One girl, her arms folded tightly across her chest, stared straight ahead, as if forcing herself not to react. Another student's mouth hung open slightly, the way you do when you realize, too late, that someone had been playing a character all along. And Jasmine, she didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply let the question linger in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Because there was no way to explain how you could insult someone with a script while privately admiring them in secret and expect to walk away unscathed. That contradiction was now bleeding out in front of the country, and Jasmine was simply holding up the mirror. Then from the right side of the auditorium, a single pair of hands clapped, soft, slow, almost reverent. Another followed, and then another, like rainfall gaining force. In seconds, the entire room broke into applause. But this wasn't the polite clapping from earlier. This wasn't academic respect. It was something raw, something electric. It was the sound of people realizing they had just seen truth win, not because it was loud, but because it refused to be denied. Phones rose again, but not for spectacle, for record. Because this wasn't just a political moment, it was history. But even as the walls shook with thunderous approval, one figure stood completely still. Barron Trump didn't move. He didn't adjust his collar. He didn't reach for the mic. He stood there swallowed by a silence so deep it almost drowned the applause. He had spent years being told he was the next voice of a dynasty. But tonight, with every camera pointed at him, with the truth still echoing in everyone's ears, he had nothing to say. Because deep down, he knew what everyone else now did. He hadn't just lost an argument. He had lost his reflection. In Jasmine Crockett. She didn't gloat. She didn't even turn away. She just stood in the center of that storm, unshaken as the applause washed over her, like proof not that she had won, but that he had finally been seen for who he really was. The last clap had barely faded when Barron's mouth parted, his voice grasping for control that no longer existed. The swagger, the precision, the authority, all of it had drained from him, replaced by a raw, disoriented panic. He reached for the mic like it might save him, like it could rewind the moment or stall the inevitable. But no microphone in the world could protect him from what had already been said in his own voice in front of the country. He opened his mouth and the words spilled out in pieces, trembling and unformed. That was a private recording. I didn't. The sentence never landed. His voice cracked under its own weight, unraveling mid-breath, like even he no longer believed it. Students in the audience didn't interrupt. They didn't mock him. What filled the room wasn't anger. It was something heavier: disbelief, disappointment, disgust. The silence that met his stammer wasn't empty. It was loaded, and it was final. Faces that once watched him with admiration now reflected something else entirely. The same students who had once whispered his name like it meant promise were now looking at him like a stranger. There was no malice in their stares, just cold recognition. Recognition that the person they thought stood for something had never truly stood for anything at all. Some eyes narrowed. Others dropped to the floor. A few students kept their phones recording, but even the energy behind the lens had shifted. This was no longer a leader under fire. This was a performer caught mid-script, exposed in front of his audience, with no more lines to hide behind. Jasmine Crockett hadn't laid a hand on him. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't even raised her voice. But somehow, with a single recording, in 2 sentences, she had dismantled the illusion. And now in front of everyone, Barron was falling through the gap where his image used to be. He tried to speak again, but the sound barely surfaced. His eyes scanned the room in desperation, as if looking for someone, anyone, to meet him halfway. But the crowd had shifted. The weight of the moment had made them colder, clearer. The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was judgmental. And Barron could feel it. He blinked hard, like trying to reset reality. He stepped back from the podium, hands twitching slightly at his sides. That towering figure who had once entered the hall like a king in waiting now looked small, suddenly swallowed by the very space he once commanded. There was no saving this. No recovery. No applause break waiting on the other side. 2 security officers in dark suits emerged near the side of the stage. They didn't storm the scene. They didn't touch him. But their presence alone made the final decision loud and clear. It was over. They walked toward him, professional, discreet, neither aggressive nor apologetic. Barron didn't protest. He didn't lift his hand in defiance or dignity. He just lowered his head, nodded slightly, and moved. Not with the weight of power, but with the weight of exposure. Each step he took toward the exit echoed in the hall like a drumbeat of defeat. He didn't look back. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't try to reclaim the room, because he knew it was no longer his to claim. When he reached the door, unassuming, side-lit, and now the only path left, he hesitated for half a second. Not long enough to speak, just long enough to realize that the walkout would be the loudest moment of his life. And then he slipped through it. No applause followed, no reaction, just a vacuum where his ambition had once stood. A student in the 4th row leaned over to their friend, voice low, but slicing through the silence like a blade. "Who's gonna believe him now?" The friend didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. The question wasn't just rhetorical, it was a eulogy, a sentence that buried the last remnants of a reputation that had collapsed under the weight of its own lies. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. 8 hours after Jasmine pressed play, the moment had become more than a viral sensation. It was a mirror held up to an entire generation who had looked at Barron Trump and seen something new, something hopeful, something human. But now that reflection, cracked frame by frame, as the sound of his own voice echoed through millions of phones and living rooms. The admission wasn't taken out of context. It was context. "I don't believe half of what I say," his voice rang out. "It's just performance. My father taught me how to win power. It wasn't a policy error or a slip of the tongue. It was a confession, unfiltered, intentional, and devastating." Reactions didn't wait for context. They didn't need permission. They poured out like a dam had broken. Across family dinner tables, group chats, college dorms, and workplaces, one question passed from mouth to mouth. "Did you hear what he said?" For years, people had projected onto Barron a kind of clean slate, a chance to see a new generation unshackled from the sins of the father. He was young, articulate, well-dressed. He smiled more than he shouted. And so they hoped. But all it took was 47 seconds of tape to show that style is not substance, that tone is not truth, and that even the tallest man can fall in silence. The backlash was swift, but it wasn't loud. It was surgical. Former supporters deleted tweets. Student groups rescinded invitations. Moderators on Barron's largest online fan forums shut threads down within minutes, fearing chaos. But chaos had already arrived. Not with fire, but with clarity. Comments flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. One rose above the rest, not because it screamed, but because it told the story no one could deny. The name Barron used to mean hope. Now it means 2 meters of designer fraud. It was brutal, but it wasn't wrong. And it was reposted so many times, it became almost biblical in its repetition. In that single line, America mourned something it didn't even realize it had wanted. They hadn't just lost faith in a person. They'd lost the fantasy that maybe one Trump could be different, that maybe integrity could rise from inheritance. But now with each replay of that clip, the illusion collapsed. The disappointment didn't come from enemies. It came from those who had once stood in his corner, held up signs, written op-eds titled, "The new Trump might surprise you." Now those same voices went quiet, or worse, turned bitter. "He could have been anything," one former campaign donor muttered. But he chose the mask. News outlets pounced. Every major network played the audio on loop, but none of them could replicate the raw silence that followed the line. "The Trump brand needs an enemy." That wasn't strategy. That was revelation. It rewrote the intent behind every speech he'd given, every photo op he'd staged, every handshake he'd delivered, with a smile and a wink. Political analysts dissected the clip with scalpels, but the public didn't need dissection. They understood it instantly. It wasn't just a gaffe. It was a worldview, a marketing plan in human form. And the product had just told the consumer, "I think you're stupid enough to buy this." Jasmine, on the other hand, said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. Her silence wasn't absence, it was a decision. Because this moment wasn't about scoring points. It was about letting the truth breathe. And that's exactly what it did. It expanded into every space the lie had once occupied. On university campuses, professors played the clip in political ethics courses. In high school debate clubs, students broke down the manipulation technique embedded in his words. In family homes, parents explained to their children why authenticity mattered and why silence sometimes can be the loudest sound. The irony was unbearable. Barron had tried to brand Jasmine as unfit to lead, unworthy of influence, a danger to democracy. But in doing so, he'd pulled back the curtain on himself. The very act of trying to destroy her became his own undoing. She's a threat, he had implied. But what he feared wasn't Jasmine, it was what she represented. A truth that didn't bend, a voice that didn't break, a mirror that didn't flatter. And now the world saw the contrast: Jasmine standing still calm, centered, while he unraveled in his own words. Behind closed doors, Barron's team panicked. They drafted statements. They called crisis consultants. Some begged him to apologize. Others urged him to blame AI, to claim the recording was fake or altered. But nothing worked. Because people didn't believe Jasmine because she was clever. They believed her because she didn't speak when it was easy. She waited. She watched. And when the world leaned in to see what she would do, she didn't grandstand, she pressed play. That was all. And that was everything. Even those who didn't like her politically had to admit she hadn't come to destroy him. She gave him rope, and he built the noose himself. The media began running comparisons. Editorials weren't just about Barron anymore. They were about generational trust, about performance politics, about what it meant to lead in an era where image eats truth for breakfast. And Jasmine, without shouting, without spinning, became the woman who exposed the most protected last name in America without ever raising her voice. As the clip passed 12 million views by morning, something irreversible had happened. Not just to Barron, but to the narrative. He wasn't a fresh start anymore. He was the sequel no one asked for. And Jasmine, she wasn't just a name anymore. She was a line in history, a reminder that sometimes the loudest revolution starts with pressing play and then staying silent. The fall didn't come with sirens. It came with silence. Barron Trump, once the rising symbol of next-generation power, now moved like a ghost through a campus that no longer looked at him the same way. After the night Jasmine Crockett exposed his own words, his manipulation, his branding strategy, his admission that truth was just theater, everything about his life began to crack. It started small, a flyer taken down, a student panel quietly replaced. Then the cancellations began. The political science seminar where he once held court empty. The elective class bearing his name dropped. The club he founded dissolved before the next semester began. Not in protest, in disinterest. Students simply stopped showing up. The aura had vanished, the myth had deflated, and in its place was a long shadow of unanswered questions. He walked the halls like a man exiled from his own kingdom. Professors offered tight-lipped nods but didn't engage. Classmates avoided eye contact not out of cruelty, but out of something more dangerous, disappointment. Barron, once the magnetic heir to America's most controversial political dynasty, now moved unnoticed. His voice, once amplified across forums, now barely cleared the inside of his own throat. He stopped offering opinions, stopped raising his hand. Even the freshmen who once lined up for photos now passed by him like he wasn't there. A quiet comment echoed in the cafeteria one afternoon. He's not canceled. He's just over. No one argued. The withdrawal was total. One by one, every platform that once spotlighted him dimmed. Invitations to conferences dried up. Mentions in conservative youth groups vanished. Some groups scrubbed his name from the archives completely, as if trying to erase the embarrassment of once believing in him. And through it all, Barron said nothing. He didn't fight back. He didn't defend. He simply retreated. The silence wasn't humility, it was survival. He still attended classes, but always late. He exited early, he sat alone. And slowly people stopped looking. Because when the mask fell off and what lay underneath wasn't the villain, but the void, there was nothing left to confront. No war to fight. Just a silence no slogan could fix. Then almost exactly 1 year later he reappeared. Not in a press conference, not on stage, but in a chair in a plain gray studio for a quiet one-on-one interview streamed on an independent network. No dramatic intro, no political logos, no crowd, just barren, older, tired eyes darker than before. He wasn't in a suit, no American flag pin, just a muted sweater and silence. The interviewer didn't waste time. She leaned in and asked, "After everything, what did you learn?" Barron took a long breath, looked down at his hands, then looked up. "I forgot," he said, voice lower than anyone remembered, "that leadership isn't about performing well. It's about living honestly." That sentence landed with more weight than any policy speech he'd ever given. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. It was fractured like him. It wasn't packaged. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just a young man once branded for greatness, trying to make sense of his own wreckage. And for a moment, just a moment, the nation paused. Was this growth, regret, a new version of the man, or just a new mask? The clip of his statement circulated quickly, not like wildfire, but like fog, slow and steady, impossible to escape. Comment sections flooded not with praise or fury, but with questions. Is this real? Is this finally him? Or is this just another performance better rehearsed? A top-liked comment read, "He's good at looking human, but he was always good at looking like something." Because that was the core of the problem. It wasn't just what Barron had said on stage a year ago, it was what he'd admitted off stage. That he didn't believe half of what he said. That the outrage was rehearsed. That Jasmine Crockett, the woman he publicly smeared, was someone he privately agreed with. And worst of all, that the Trump brand needed enemies. Now here he was, alone in a studio, offering something that sounded like truth. But truth is fragile when it comes from someone who once called it a tool. And for the millions watching the conflict wasn't just with Barron, it was within themselves. Could a man who weaponized lies be trusted when he finally whispered something that sounded like honesty? The debate raged on. News outlets split down the middle. Some called it redemption. Others called it the soft re-entry of a carefully coached legacy. Influencers posted reaction videos dissecting his tone, his pauses, his body language. But none of that mattered as much as the silence in the room during his statement. It wasn't what he said. It was how much it hurt to realize he might be telling the truth now, when it no longer mattered. A student who once volunteered on Barron's campaign team posted a video shaking his head. He's not dangerous because he lied. He's dangerous because he convinced us the lie felt better than the truth. The clip went viral. So did another, a side-by-side of Barron's original smear against Jasmine, followed by the leaked recording, then his new statement. The caption read, 3 acts, 1 actor. Which one is real? There were no clear answers, but something had undeniably shifted. Barron didn't announce a return to politics. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He simply said his sentence and sat in it. That alone felt different. Not better, but different. Still, even his silence felt curated now. That's what happens when you treat sincerity like strategy for too long. Eventually, no one can tell the difference. The final moment of the interview captured it best. The host asked, "Do you think people will ever trust you again?" Barron didn't answer immediately. He looked down, rubbed his thumb against his palm, then whispered, "I'm not sure they should." And with that, the screen faded to black. Not redemption, not condemnation, just silence again. But this time, the silence wasn't his shield. It was his sentence. The fall of Barron Trump didn't just create a vacuum, it created a contrast. And in that contrast, one name began to rise like fire through fog: Jasmine Crockett. The woman who didn't yell, didn't flinch, didn't chase the camera. She simply stood, held the line, and spoke the truth. As Barron faded from news cycles and became the subject of late-night mockery, Jasmine's name began to take on a different kind of weight. Not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol. News anchors began calling her the warrior who didn't blink. Late shows replayed the clip, not for entertainment, but for education. Students quoted her. Professors assigned her words in political science classes. In a time when performance often replaced principle, Jasmine had cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Not by attacking louder, but by standing taller. She never asked to be a hero, and that's what made her one. Interviews flooded in. Magazines wanted cover stories. Think pieces titled, "The Last Honest Voice in Politics," or "Why Jasmine Crockett Terrifies the Machine," appeared across major platforms. But Jasmine didn't chase the attention. She declined more interviews than she accepted. And the ones she did take, she used every second to speak directly, with zero script, zero rehearsal, and zero compromise. In one interview with a national network, the host leaned forward and asked, "What made you speak up that night? What gave you the courage?" Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned into the mic, smiled gently, and answered, "It's not courage, it's clarity. I didn't come to Washington to survive. I came to tell the truth no matter what it costs." The line went viral not because it was catchy, but because it was rare. That same interview included a moment that would echo even louder. The host asked her about the future of politics, whether she believed younger generations could still trust the system. Jasmine paused for a beat, then spoke with a quiet, lethal sharpness. "If you don't believe in what you're saying, then it's not a belief, it's an ad campaign." The room went still. Producers backstage looked at each other. Editors circled the moment, clipped it, and uploaded it before the segment even ended. It was replayed millions of times in under 24 hours. Students printed it on shirts, protesters wrote it on posters, and veteran politicians, many of whom had built entire careers on spinning words, sat back and realized they'd just been stripped of their favorite mask. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician anymore. She had become something rarer, a mirror. Wherever she went, people didn't just ask for selfies. They asked for guidance. They asked her how to stand when standing came with risk. Young black girls wrote her letters. Veterans shook her hand and whispered thanks. Journalists who once chased scandal now chased authenticity, and they knew she wouldn't give them headlines, only substance. But perhaps the most telling moment came during a televised panel weeks later. One of her former critics, a senior strategist, known for advising some of the loudest voices in American politics, sat across from her and said live on national television, "I used to think Jasmine Crockett was dangerous. Now I think she might be necessary." And that's when something shifted again. A new nickname began circulating, not crafted by her team, not approved by focus groups, but grown from the public. The anti-actor. Because she didn't perform, she didn't posture, she didn't sell dreams, she challenged reality. Editorials labeled her the political antidote to the performance age. A viral tweet with over 1 million likes read, "If Jasmine Crockett ever runs for president, she won't need a campaign slogan. Her face is the slogan." But Jasmine didn't let it change her. She kept her tone even, her focus unshaken. "I'm not interested in applause," she told one journalist. "I'm interested in accountability." What terrified her opponents wasn't her charisma. It was her consistency. The fact that she could face a billionaire's son on national stage and never once raise her voice, but still leave him voiceless. The fact that while others threw accusations, she asked questions. While others delivered rehearsed monologues, she listened. And when it mattered most, she pressed play. One clip, one voice, one moment of silence turned into millions of moments of reflection. The same people who once dismissed her as too blunt, too bold, or too unwilling to play the game now had to admit Jasmine Crockett didn't play games because she wasn't trying to win them. She was trying to end them. In town halls across the country, her speech was quoted by organizers. "If you don't believe in what you're saying," they would begin and the crowd would finish it together. Then it's not a belief, it's an ad campaign. It became a call to arms for a generation tired of politics as theater. College students chanted it outside buildings. Young candidates quoted her during debates. And for the first time in a long time, people weren't just following a politician. They were following an example. One not built on strategy, but on spine. One not designed to provoke, but to protect. One rooted not in optics, but in obligation. Still, Jasmine remained cautious of the pedestal. In another rare interview, she warned, "Don't make me your hero. Make yourself your standard. I'm not perfect. I just refuse to be part of the lie." That kind of clarity didn't sell books. It didn't get sponsorships, but it lit fires. Fires in classrooms, in church halls, in boardrooms, where people finally stood up and said, "I won't pretend anymore." And as the echo of her confrontation with Barron Trump slowly turned into history, the lesson remained fresh. Because that moment didn't end when the clip stopped. It multiplied. Every time someone remembered it, every time someone whispered, "She stood her ground," the impact repeated. By the end of the year, a major university announced a new elective course titled Performance versus Principle, the Crockett Doctrine. It filled within hours. Professors designed curriculum around her congressional hearings, her interview quotes, and of course, the Georgetown showdown. The course didn't worship Jasmine, it studied her. It asked the same questions she had once asked Barron Trump. Is politics the truth, or is it just a stage? And each student had to answer it for themselves. Not with applause, not with performance, but with courage. Because Jasmine Crockett proved one thing that year, something no scandal, no slogan, and no 30-second ad could erase. When truth walks into a room, lies don't get to keep the spotlight. And from that moment forward, she didn't just become a face in politics, she became a line in history. And just like that, the moment multiplied. What began as a single clip began to roam free, carried by the hands of millions. Not ads, not speeches, but living, breathing young people who hit replay again and again. On smartphones in dorms, in college study halls, at coffee shops, and even in pandemic-era living rooms, Jasmine's stance became a calling card. A digital survival guide written not in code, but in clarity. These weren't just views. They were legacies being forged. Teenage students shared the clip with notes like, "Watch this before your first election." Activist groups built online panels around it. High school civics teachers built lesson plans around it. And all across the country, a generation trained for cynicism found a moment powerful enough to set cynicism ablaze. The reaction wasn't just volume, it was volume with purpose. Comments poured in from every corner. "This is how you should learn politics truth. First manipulation, never. I sent it to my brother in the military. He said it was more important than his drill bits." My daughter's school asked me to show it on career day, saying this is how leaders should sound. It wasn't about loyalty to Jasmine. It was about what she made possible: conviction, without performance courage, without theatrics leadership, without lies. That realization shocked people awake. That clip became a masterclass in surviving not by being strong, but by saying what's right even if you know everyone is watching. And for a whole generation battered by spin, it had the thrum of a lifeline. Meanwhile, elsewhere, older viewers, those who'd long ago turned off the signal, started tuning back in. It was rare for them to share clips or posts, but this time they did. Not with pride, but with whispered reverence. In living rooms lit by quiet lamps, grandparents watched with mild tears, smiles forming at the edges. One grandfather posted to Facebook, "Finally someone who isn't playing them." Another senior citizen, known for scrolling past politics, entirely wrote, "Finally someone in Congress who says what they mean." These comments weren't meant for engagement metrics. They were worn on each word, because there were years or decades when truth in politics seemed like a myth. And here it was. The video wasn't just replayed, it was studied. Young journalists posted breakdowns. Notice how Jasmine doesn't raise her voice. She lets her stance do the work. Seniors on forums posted, "At my age, I've seen politicians lie before lunch. Watching her was like breathing fresh air again." That combination, it wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. A moment so pure it cut across generational lines. So they watched again, shared again, and thought again. Because for the first time in a long time, politics wasn't entertainment, it was redemption. Some students said they watched it like a lifeline. Others said it was the date they remembered democracy still exists. Posters sprung up on campuses, truth theater. Quote, journalism classes began lectures with playback of the clip. Civic clubs hosted debates titled, "Is Politics, Performance, or Principle?" All inspired by one calm woman who pressed play. No shout, no showmanship, just truth winning. And that changed something. It made woke feel meaningful again, like it wasn't just protest language, but a call to foundational honesty. And young people answered. Meanwhile, people with years of wear in their bones watched it and sighed with relief, because it reminded them of a time before politics became a reality show. "Finally, there's someone who doesn't owe the cameras," said one viewer. "Finally, there's someone who doesn't need the soundbite," said another. These whispers weren't broadcast, they were quiet, but they carried weight. They built walls. They passed knowledge across generations. And they ended with one shared line more powerful than most campaign slogans. Finally, someone dared to speak the real. In the end, that clip didn't just break the internet, it healed it. It convinced people of two truths: that courage still matters and that sincerity still resonates. Millions of views turned into countless quiet awakenings. A generation doubting politics rediscovered their anger and their hope. Older generations, long jaded, remembered how change begins not with a campaign, but with clarity. And in that electric stillness between one truth and the next, something enduring was born: the idea that politics doesn't have to be performance. That sometimes choosing to speak the truth, especially in a room full of glare, is the most radical act of leadership. The applause faded. The screens dimmed. But what lingered wasn't the image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, it was the silence that came after. A silence heavy with realization. Something deeper than politics had just happened, and everyone, young, old, red, blue, felt it settle in their chest like a truth too big to ignore. This wasn't about Barron Trump anymore. It wasn't even about the lies he told or the cameras he played to. It was about the cost of pretending, the way performance had replaced principle, the way millions had started confusing charisma for character. Jasmine didn't destroy a man. She exposed a system. And that system looked a lot like us. We live in a world where politics has become theater, where leaders audition more than they govern, and where applause has become louder than accountability. But when Jasmine pressed play, she didn't just expose Barron's voice, she reminded us of our own, of the voices we've silenced in ourselves to fit in, to be liked, to be safe. Her calm didn't come from ego. It came from exhaustion from watching too many lies get rebranded as strategy. And when she said, "If you don't believe what you say, then it's not an opinion, it's a marketing campaign. She wasn't just talking to Barron. She was talking to anyone who's ever stood on a stage and chosen applause over honesty. And she was talking to the rest of us too, the ones who clapped. The real lesson isn't that Jasmine was brave. It's that bravery didn't look like a fight. It looked like stillness. It looked like knowing the truth, holding it in your hands, and waiting until the exact second the mask dropped. She didn't yell. She didn't punch. She waited. Because deep down she knew the truth doesn't need fireworks. It just needs the right moment. And when that moment comes, it lands not like a scream, but like a mirror. And in that mirror, we don't just see the liar. We see who we believed and why. Barron was raised in a world where power meant perception, where reality could be edited, where empathy was weakness and control was king. But the lesson Jasmine gave wasn't just to him, it was to every young person watching. It said you don't have to become the show to survive it. You don't need to perform to lead. And more importantly, you don't have to lie to matter. Leadership isn't loud, it's consistent, it's clear. It's showing up with the truth even when everyone's waiting for you to fail. Especially then. And maybe the most painful part of all is this: Barron wasn't entirely wrong. The world does reward spectacle. The system does love villains and heroes more than facts and nuance. But Jasmine didn't ask to change the world in one day. She only asked to tell the truth in one room. And that's where the lesson sits, quiet, steady, unshaken. The real revolution isn't in votes or speeches. It's in refusing to play the game the way they taught you. Because the moment you stop playing, the performance collapses. And what's left is real. What Jasmine did that day wasn't destroy Barron. It was rescue the truth from the jaws of narrative. And once rescued, it didn't need defending. The truth stood on its own. It echoed not in slogans, but in second thoughts. It whispered in every silent viewer. Maybe I've accepted too many lies for too long. It nudged teachers to rethink what they taught. It made parents rethink what they modeled. It made voters ask harder questions. And it made young people ask the most important one: who am I when nobody's clapping? Because in the end, that's what it comes down to. Not politics, not legacy, not viral clips, but who you are when no one's watching. Jasmine reminded us that being honest in private matters more than being perfect in public. That your voice is worth using even if it shakes. That silence, when used right, can be the loudest sound in the room. And that standing up isn't about being stronger than your opponent. It's about being clearer than the noise. For once, a political story didn't end with a press release. It ended with a pause, a breath, a reflection, and for many, a change. But the story doesn't end with silence. It begins there. Because after the room went still, after the applause faded and the camera stopped rolling, something even more powerful began: reflection. Not just about Barron Trump or Jasmine Crockett, but about us, about how we listen, how we choose, and how we stay quiet when we know better. Jasmine didn't just expose a lie, she held up a mirror to the world and forced it to look. And now that we've seen what's behind the curtain, the question is, what will we do with that truth? Will we move on like it was just another headline? Or will we finally break the cycle? We're living in an era where performance is prized more than principle, where slick speeches matter more than lived values, where politicians don't need to believe what they say, just say what gets a cheer. But Jasmine reminded us that truth spoken plainly and without apology still cuts through the noise. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was resistance. It was proof that integrity doesn't need a spotlight to shine. That courage isn't about shouting, it's about standing when it's easier to sit. And that real leadership means doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. That's not politics. That's humanity. So what does this mean for us ordinary people watching from a distance? It means we don't have to wait for someone in Congress to speak for us. We can speak for ourselves in our schools, our workplaces, our families. It means questioning the loudest voice in the room and listening for the quiet ones who often get ignored. It means remembering that power only survives when we let it hide behind confusion. And truth only dies when we stop asking hard questions. Jasmine didn't win because she had the most applause. She won because she stayed honest when it mattered most. That's something we all can do. Let's stop pretending we're powerless. Stop assuming the system is too broken to fix. Because every broken system was once protected by people who were too afraid to challenge it. Barron said it himself, audiences are meant to be manipulated. But that only works if we keep clapping for the wrong things. We need to be harder to impress, slower to forgive hypocrisy, quicker to uplift those who speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Jasmine didn't come to destroy someone. She came to remind us that performance without principle is poison. And if we keep drinking it, we can't be shocked when it kills the democracy we claim to love. This is not about left or right. It's about real and fake, about truth and spin, about the kind of country we want to live in and the kind of leaders we want to raise. Barron was trained to perform. Jasmine was trained to endure. One crumbled in 47 seconds. The other walked out stronger than ever. That contrast should shake us, because it's not just their story, it's a reflection of every choice we make as voters, parents, teachers, citizens. Do we reward the best actor or the most honest voice? Do we scroll past the truth or stop and spread it? Do we wait for the next Jasmine or become her? Now is the moment to act, not with outrage, but with clarity. Start where you are. In every meeting where someone stays silent out of fear, be the one who speaks. In every election where the loudest liar rises, be the vote that says, not this time. In every conversation where cynicism takes over, remind people that hope isn't naive, it's necessary. And if someone tells you your truth is too much, tell them this. If you were born with a microphone, learn to listen before you use it. Because the truth doesn't come with an edit button. You don't need a podium to change the world. You need a spine. You need patience. And you need to know the difference between attention and impact. Jasmine didn't trend because she chased views. She trended because she told the truth and let the consequences come. That's the power of courage. Not to avoid the fire, but to walk into it holding someone else's truth alongside your own. So let this be the day you stop asking for permission to care. Let this be the day you stop mistaking silence for peace. Let this be the day you stand. Because if we learned anything from this story, it's this: the most dangerous lie isn't the one we hear. It's the one we accept. And yet, as the noise settles and the drama fades from headlines to memory, something quieter begins to bloom, something far more enduring. In classrooms, students replay the hearing not for entertainment, but for insight. In homes, parents reference Jasmine's words when teaching their kids the difference between ambition and authenticity. In coffee shops and late-night texts, friends ask each other, are we living the truth or just surviving the script? Her voice measured steady, undeniable echoes far beyond Capitol Hill. Because what she shattered wasn't just one man's illusion. It was a system built on pretending that values are negotiable. Months later, a college in Ohio adds a new course, Leadership and the Lie. The opening lecture features Jasmine's confrontation, now studied like a turning point in civic discourse. A mural goes up on the side of a Houston community center, not of Jasmine holding a microphone, but of her standing with her arms crossed, no spotlight, just truth in her posture. The caption reads, "Say it like you mean it," or "Don't say it at all." It becomes a local saying. And slowly people start holding themselves and their leaders to that simple rule. Even Barron, long removed from the stage, becomes part of the lesson. Not as a villain, but as a caution. A reminder of what happens when performance outruns principle. His silence becomes louder than any speech he ever gave. And in that silence, a generation begins to hear something different: the cost of faking it, the loneliness of manipulation, the public collapse of a brand built on borrowed conviction. What Jasmine exposed wasn't just dishonesty, it was the fragility of influence without integrity. So when people ask what changed, they don't point to a law. They point to a moment, a line, a voice that didn't tremble when the cameras turned on. They remember Jasmine Crockett not because she went viral, but because she left a mark, not just on politics, but on the people watching, especially the ones who thought truth had no chance in a world of spin. And maybe, just maybe, they start to believe that standing firm in your truth is not only possible, but contagious. Because courage doesn't end when the spotlight dims. It begins where the echo carries. And Jasmine's echo is still traveling. And that echo keeps finding new voices. In classrooms, young students quote her speech during civics debates. In union halls, workers replay the clip before walking into negotiations. On quiet nights, veterans and nurses scroll past the noise and stop when they see her face, not because she promised them everything, but because she reminded them they still matter. She didn't fix America in one day. She did something harder. She made people look again, think again, and refuse to shrug off injustice as just politics. Her name became a shorthand for backbone, for decency under fire. Long after the trending tags disappeared, her words stayed pinned in people's hearts like a challenge. Speak up, show up, stand tall. Because the truth isn't fragile, it's waiting for someone brave enough to carry it forward. And somewhere tonight, another voice is finding its courage, following the trail Jasmine left burning through the dark. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.